If I want to understand something in nature, I must not leave nature with my explanation. If I want to understand the whole of nature, however, then I must be outside of its boundaries. Immanuel Kant. I'm now approaching the end of the, so to speak, first chapter of my lecture series on Kant, where I wanted to talk about the school concept of philosophy, according to Kant. One last time, I want to repeat what I have said so far. I said that to Kant, science is about knowledge, or rather, it is about systematic knowledge. That is what differentiates it from common knowledge, which is not systematic. This scientific, systematic knowledge can either be historic scholarship, when it is just about being aware of things, being aware that things are the way they are because we observe them to be that way. Or it can be rational science, when we understand things, when we understand why they are the way they are and why they have to be the way they are according to a law. When we see them, to once again say it with Fichte, when we see them genetically come into being according to that law. Well, and this rational science, in turn, Kant split into mathematical science and philosophical science. Philosophical science was about knowledge or cognition through concepts, and mathematical science was about knowledge, rational knowledge or cognition through the construction of concepts. And then the philosophical science was either formal philosophical science, which was logic, or it was material philosophical science, and in that case it could either be theoretical, if it is a science of being, a science of nature, a science dealing with the laws of things as they are, or it could be practical, if it is a science of freedom, a science dealing with the laws of things as they ought to be. That is where I left off. But now I want to remind you that I also said that according to Kant, all rational science can be split once again into two parts. That is pure science, which is cognition through reason alone, without any help by sensuality, and applied science, which is cognition with the help of experience, which is empirical cognition. And if, as Kant says, that is true for every science, then one would assume that it is true for philosophical science as well. Now, for logic, I already talked about this in the last lecture. I said that pure logic is simply about the formal rules of thinking, which would be the same for any rational being, not just for a human being. And then, on the other hand, applied logic would deal with us as humans, with the conditions of our species and how that influences our thinking, how that leads us to certain errors in thinking, to certain mistakes, to certain wrong conclusions, and how we can deal with that. Which which applied logic would be based on empirical psychology, on the knowledge that empirical psychology brings. So I don't want to talk further about logic here. I want to put the formal philosophy aside and only deal with the material philosophy in its two parts, in the theoretical and the practical part. Starting with practical philosophy, because here it's a little more unclear whether there even is such a thing as practical philosophy. To once again remind you, practical philosophy is not about what is, according to Kant, it is about what shall be. And therefore, it can only really have a pure part if we are strict. Because, well, only reason can tell us what ought to be, while experience, and once again, applied science means that experience is somehow involved. Experience can only tell us what is. It can only tell us something about being. We can't have an experience of what ought to be. If there was to be something like applied practical philosophy, it could have two meanings. For one, Kant says applied practical philosophy could deal with how to make humans moral. In that case, practical philosophy would be structured in a way similarly to logic, because pure practical philosophy would just give the moral law, and that moral law, that abstract law, would have nothing to do with our human condition. So pure practical philosophy would just say what is good, what is evil, what ought to happen according to reason. And that would hold true not just for humans, that wouldn't just be our duty as humans, but if there are aliens somewhere, or if there are angels, or even God himself, they would still be under the same moral law as we. But then, just like the applied logic takes into account our human condition and our human shortcomings, so we could think of an applied practical philosophy doing that. Kant calls that practical anthropology. This practical anthropology would deal with, well, the way humans are, the desires that humans tend to have, and would deal with how to bring a human being to a point where he follows the moral law, and how to deal with whatever in him is opposed to that moral law. And Kant does consider that an important question. He does consider that sort of practical anthropology to be important, but it is not really applied practical philosophy, because it, once again, it is not about an ought, because just like applied logic, it would have to take its knowledge from the knowledge of the empirical psychology. But that is a theoretical science. That is a science that tells us how the human being is. And we would then take this being into consideration in our actions, but that in itself would not be practical. Because the practical, the moral law just tells us to be good. So if we then learn how we can achieve that, then we have to take this path. But the law in itself doesn't tell us which path best leads us to goodness. And that science which may tell us which path would be the most sensible one, that science is theoretical. Well, the second possibility is to say that applied practical philosophy would be what Kant calls the doctrine of happiness. So a philosophy that deals with how to become happy. Because this also deals with freedom. This is about our free choices and how we act. And this, in a way, deals with laws of freedom. So with reason telling us how we should use our freedom, reason telling us what we should do. But in this case, the laws are conditional, because pure practical philosophy is when reason simply tells us this is how you should act, period. This is not how you should act in order to achieve some goal. This is simply how you should act. You should be good, period. And this obviously is a pure science. It's not based on any sort of experience. But if we ask how to become happy, well, reason might tell us this is how you should act, but it will add if you want to be happy. If you don't want to be happy, then you don't have to act that way. You only have to take these actions if you want to achieve happiness. And that we want to achieve happiness, that it is indeed our goal, that is something that we can't know through pure reason. That is something we know empirically. From experience, we know that we ourselves and that every other human being wants to become happy. And then reason says, well, if that is the case, if you want to be happy, then here is what you should do. So therefore, this could be considered an applied practical science, Kant says. And if you were to say that the doctrine of happiness is the applied practical science, then you could in turn split it into two parts again, Kant says. One would be the science dealing with individual happiness, and this he calls economy. And one would be the science dealing with happiness of the people, of the state, and this he calls politics or political science. I want to stress here that the word economy is not to be understood the way we would understand it today. For the longest part, this was true in antiquity, and this was still true in Kant's day. For the longest part, economy was mainly about how should I lead my own household? How should I lead my own affairs? I mean, it comes from oikos, from the Greek word for house, and that is the reason why economy to Kant is the teaching of personal happiness. How should I live my life? How should I go about achieving my goals? How should I deal with my resources that I have at my possession in order to become happy? While economy in a larger sense, so economy not for an individual but for a state, for a whole nation, that Kant would probably subsume under politics. We call that economy too today, or rather we call that especially economy, but to him that would probably be part of politics, because politics to him would be the science teaching how to not just achieve happiness for an individual, but achieve happiness for a nation. However, Kant would stress that this doctrine of happiness would ultimately once again be a doctrine of skills. It is, as I already said in the previous lecture, what you need here is theoretical knowledge. You need to know how the world is, how the world functions. You need to know about the conditions of the world in order to know how exactly you could reach happiness. So in that sense, this would not be a truly practical science, according to Kant, because it would not be simply about what you should do. It would rather just have to look at, well, the laws of nature, the laws under which the being, the existing things function, and then it would just have to make use of those laws. Well, in the case of theoretical philosophy, the answer is a bit easier to give. What is applied theoretical philosophy to Kant? Well, it is natural science. Because, let me remind you, theoretical philosophy is about understanding the things that are. And now, when we look at what is applied theoretical philosophy, we are seeking a science that tries to understand the things that are with the help of experience, with empirical observation. Well, that is natural science. And this natural science too is split into two parts by Kant, because, well, since this is an applied science, it is based on sensuality. Well, Kant says there are two basic senses. The inner sense, through which we perceive our own feelings, our own sensations, our own thoughts, any sort of representations, which we don't perceive to be in space, but which we do perceive to be in time. And then there's the outer sense, through which we perceive other things, other objects, and we perceive extended things, spatially extended things. So therefore, Kant says, there are two objects natural science can deal with. The thinking being, that is the soul, or the extended being, that is matter, that is bodies. And so therefore, it is split, the natural science, it is split into two parts: the doctrine of the soul, that is empirical psychology, and the doctrine of the body, that is empirical physics. So I want to stress that physics, in the way Kant uses the word, is a broader term than the science we call physics today. Because, once again, to Kant, physics is the natural science of the outer sense, of the outward world. It is the natural science of extended things, of bodies, of matter. It deals with all laws of the movements of matter. So it would it would include physics in today's sense, but it would also include chemistry, or it would also include biology, at least insofar as they deal with actual laws. If they are just observing what happens in nature, that falls under historical scholarship. That's not part of the philosophical science. So not every natural scientist is a philosopher to Kant, but those parts of biology or of chemistry that deal with the laws of the movement of matter, that deal with how matter moves and forms itself and even organizes itself, those parts to Kant would fall under empirical physics. And this might be a good place to say a few words about this connection between philosophy and natural science. Because nowadays the two seem to be very much split up. But to Kant, that is not the case, and that is not such a special thing. That is not something very surprising, because in his time, that was how everyone saw it, not just Kant. And not just in his time, but for the longest time. Philosophy is the mother of science. And all the other sciences have developed as parts of philosophy and have only eventually split from philosophy. If we look back at antiquity, we find that the very first philosopher of all, that is Thales, is also considered the first natural scientist. And also someone like Aristotle, who was such an important and eminent philosopher, was also a very important natural scientist who had the greatest influence on the scientific theories and the natural scientific worldview for centuries, throughout the whole Middle Ages and even beyond the Middle Ages. And if we look at more recent examples, if we look at examples from Kant's own period, that is the age of Aufklärung, we can find that such great and important philosophers such as Descartes or Leibniz were also very important natural scientists. They're also dealing with questions of physics. On the other hand, we find that a physicist like Newton dealt with philosophical questions. In Kant's own century, in Germany in the 18th century, one of the most important physicists and mathematicians was Lambert. And he, for example, proved pi to be an irrational number. And he is considered the founder of photometry. And he approached Kant. He started writing to Kant, and then they exchanged letters for a while. But he approached Kant to discuss metaphysical questions with him. He approached Kant because of a metaphysical work of Kant, because of his pre-critical text on the possible proofs for God. And it was the question of how to do metaphysics and how to turn metaphysics into a proper science, which Lambert and Kant mainly discussed. As a side note, Lambert's remarks and questions were very important for Kant in forming his critical system. The letters of Lambert, along with the letters of Mendelssohn, certainly had the most influence out of all the people Kant was in dialogue with, and it was the input of these two, and I would say more so the input of Lambert than the one of Mendelssohn, which was very influential on Kant, and apparently he had also meant for a while to dedicate the critique of pure reason to Lambert. However, Lambert ended up dying before the book was finished, so unfortunately he couldn't see and read the finished product anymore, to which his dialogue with Kant had contributed so much. But anyways, these examples should show that for people back then in the 18th century, the present split between natural science and philosophy didn't yet exist in their minds. We can also observe that Kant was considered a philosopher. He is addressed as a philosopher in letters that people write to him, even before he had written and published texts that we nowadays would consider philosophical. And when the text he had published so far had more dealt with questions of physics, of mechanics, of astronomy, still that apparently was enough to be considered a philosopher. And this is something that one should keep in mind while reading Kant. When he talks about philosophers, when he says, the philosophers do this and that, the philosophers think in this and that way, he is not just talking about what we nowadays would still call a philosopher, but he's also talking about natural scientists. Not everyone who would nowadays be called a natural scientist would be a philosopher to Kant. For example, Linné is not a philosopher to Kant, because once again, if it's just historical scholarship, if they are just observing the things that are, maybe catalogizing them, maybe systematizing that knowledge, but ultimately just observing what is, not understanding that it needs to be that way, then they are just historical scholars. But as soon as they deal with laws, for example, someone like Newton is a philosopher to Kant. Here you should also consider how universities were structured in Kant's time. And not just in his time, but rather for centuries had been structured, since the Middle Ages, since more or less their founding. And only in Kant's days, or shortly after Kant's days, shortly after his death in the 19th century, only then did universities start to change more into, well, the universities we know today. For the longest time, universities were split into 4 faculties. There was the theological faculty, there was the faculty of law, there was the faculty of medicine, and these 3 were together the higher faculties. And then there was the lower faculty, and that was the philosophical faculty. However, that was more like the faculty of everything else. So it didn't just deal with logic and morality and metaphysics, but it also included the teaching of natural science, or, for example, the study of literature, as far as it did already exist back then. So there were some professorships of poetry that also belonged into the philosophical faculty. So that's why it wasn't strange at all for Kant as a philosopher, as a member of the philosophical faculty, to also deal with natural science and to also hold lectures on natural science. Back then, the philosophical faculty was the lower faculty because it was more there to give a general education, to give an introduction into scholarship, but you were not meant to stay in the philosophical faculty. You would graduate as a magister, so nowadays we would say master, and then you would usually go into one of the three higher faculties to maybe become a doctor in one of them, and then maybe go on to work as a pastor or as a lawyer or as a physician. And the way Kant viewed this system and these faculties was that he says the higher faculties are concerned with sustaining and securing the human being. So the theological faculty is concerned with sustaining our soul, with securing a blessed afterlife, securing an afterlife in heaven and not in hell. The faculty of law is concerned with sustaining our position, our standing in the state, in civil society. It is concerned with securing our property, our rights. And then the faculty of medicine, of course, is concerned with sustaining our body, with securing our health. And the philosophical faculty, on the other hand, Kant says, is not needed. But when he says that, he doesn't mean that it is therefore lesser. Quite the opposite. In his mind, that gives the philosophical faculty its proper dignity, because it's like in other parts of life. What you need is food. What you need is shelter. You don't need friends. You don't need a family. You don't need fun or hobbies or whatever. But then, exactly for that reason, we give more worth to them. Of course, the basics have first to be met. I mean, I first need to survive, but then life should be about more than that. And the same, Kant says, is true in science. Of course, the basics need to come first, and of course, our soul, our property, our health has to be secured. But then Kant says we should do more than just live. We should educate ourselves further. We should cultivate ourselves. We should understand the world better and make better use of it, behave ever more rationally, and use reason in ever more elaborate ways to form and shape the world and make use of it according to our needs and goals. And that is why ultimately humanity could do with just the three higher faculties and without philosophy. And here philosophy is meaning everything. So philosophy in the closer sense, metaphysics, but also natural science. Humanity could do without natural science. We don't need all the advances in natural science that we have now. I mean, we did survive in the Middle Ages or in antiquity or even in the Stone Ages too without it. But exactly for that reason, it has a higher dignity and in some way a higher importance than the other faculties in Kant's mind. Another thing that I find helpful in understanding this relationship that philosophy and natural science had back then is the word Weltweisheit, which literally translates to worldwisdom. The word has since long fallen out of fashion again, but in the 18th century in Germany, it was used quite frequently as a sort of synonym and German translation for the word philosophy. And Kant too, especially in his earlier pre-critical writings, often uses the word. And this word too encapsulates all of philosophy, so including natural science. But why is it called world wisdom? Well, it can probably be understood in three ways at the same time. First, this wisdom is a wisdom that comes from the world, out of the world, meaning it doesn't come from God, because that is what the theologians would say. Their wisdom, their knowledge comes through revelation, through the Bible, from God. It comes from beyond the world. While the philosophical faculty seeks wisdom, seeks knowledge out of the world, by means of the world, without help by God. So whether it's natural science using empirical means, or whether it's metaphysics using speculation, using pure reason, both means using the means of the world and not receiving knowledge from God. Secondly, world wisdom is also wisdom that is only about the world. The theologians would stress that with the means of experience or of reason, you can't know anything about the afterlife, or you can't know anything about the inner nature of God. You can't deduce from reason that God is a trinity, that God has these three persons of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And you also can't know from pure reason that God became man and sacrificed himself for humanity. So they would say that the philosopher only has knowledge or wisdom about the world, about this world, not about the next world, not about what goes beyond the world. And then thirdly, it would also be called world wisdom because, well, the thought behind that is this wisdom, which is from the world and about the world, is also only helpful in the world. So maybe all this knowledge of, for example, the natural scientist helps you constructing machines, helps you with technology, helps making your life easier in this world. Or maybe the philosopher has good advice on how to live a good life in this world, like the ancient Greek philosophers, to whom the question of the good life, of how to achieve happiness, was very important. So that which Kant would call the doctrine of happiness, that which might be considered the applied practical philosophy. But again, the theologian would say all of that doesn't help you one bit once you stand before God and are judged by God. All of that doesn't help you one bit to get into heaven and avoid hell. So the term Weltweisheit, world wisdom, with these three meanings, therefore stands in a very long tradition which exists in Christianity, which one could say goes back to the very first Christians and to the Bible itself. Because even in the Bible, you have warnings against the philosophers, so against the ancient Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, whose wisdom would be world wisdom, and who would tell you how the world is structured and who would tell you how to achieve a good life. For example, the Epicureans would have told you to seek out pleasure. And against that, the Bible warns. And in the New Testament, you have Paul famously saying that our faith, the faith in the crucified Christ, is to the Jews a stumbling block, because of course the Jews are still waiting for their Messiah, for their Christ, and they don't believe that he will be crucified. They believe he will be some warlord and king to liberate them and to bring them into a new kingdom. It is to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Gentiles a folly. And by Gentiles, Paul is mainly referring to the Greeks. And when he is referring to the Greeks, well, that's the Greeks with all of their education and all of their philosophy, the Greeks who are known to be so wise and so smart and so scientific and so rational, and to like to have these philosophical dialectical debates. What he is saying is that, well, when they hear what we are preaching, that God turned into man and that he died in the most miserable way possible to save us from our sins, they are laughing at us. To them, it's nonsense. It's foolishness. And they are right in a sense. According to their wisdom, to their world wisdom, it is indeed a folly. But that is exactly the point, that their wisdom can't go beyond the world, and they are arrogant and presumptuous if they believe that they, with their small human minds, that they, finite beings that they are, that they have everything figured out. And the early Christians and their discussions with the non-Christians and their philosophy would even at times take pride in their belief being nonsense. There is the famous Christian saying, credo quia absurdum est. That means, I believe it not in spite of it being absurd, but because it is absurd. So yes, of course, our faith in a God turned man and crucified for man, or our faith in a God who is at the same time three and one, that is foolishness. That is not wise. That is not logical, according to you philosophers. But that only shows that we did indeed receive revelation, that we did indeed receive a higher wisdom that you could never arrive at with your logic shopping. So that is the background through which you can understand this word world wisdom. And for the longest time, philosophy was called the servant or the maid of theology. And to this, Kant says, well, that's fine, but it still leaves open the question whether this maid is bearing the talk in front of her mistress and walking in front of her with the talk, or if she is just walking after the mistress and carrying her train for her. Of course, considering all of that, it is somewhat ironic that theology, which 200 years ago still sort of considered itself the queen of all sciences, that theology and philosophy have now both been cast aside. They are still tolerated at universities. So some people would actually like to see them abolished altogether as academic subjects. But no one really cares about what they have to say. The other sciences don't take them seriously, and the public doesn't take them seriously either. And this is a change that came about after Kant's death, that came about in the 19th century largely. And since the 19th century and essentially till today, we see more and more new sciences, new subjects, new faculties appearing at universities and disturbing this old structure of the four faculties. And philosophy is mostly left with logic, morals, and metaphysics, while all the other things like natural science are no longer considered a part of philosophy. And in the 19th century, we can observe a drastic change in worldview. If we were to describe it in the old terminology, which too got dropped, however, we would say that now the intellectuals and the educated classes came to believe that world wisdom was all that was needed, that you didn't need any higher wisdom that came from revelation, but rather those were old superstitions. So the new ideology that arose in the 19th century would say that as for understanding, all there was to be understood could be understood through material natural science. And as for the practical side of things, as for acting, we didn't need some moral law telling us what to do. We could improve our lives through that same natural science, by progress in that science, by technological progress, by progress in medicine. And if our life needed improvement beyond that, it was to be political improvement, which some might still have wanted to base on science, but then they didn't want to base it on philosophy, on moral science, but rather they wanted to base it on a theory of sociology, for example, like the Marxists, like the communists tried. Well, and nowadays it should be quite apparent where this development has led us. It has brought us totalitarianism. It has brought us wars and genocides on a never before known scale. And it has finally brought us the ecological crisis. It has brought us on the brink of complete ecological and climate collapse. And we find that it has brought us widespread relativism and nihilism and a general feeling shared by many, many people of being lost, being aimless, being without purpose. And now we can observe that the class which mainly pushed that ideology and which still holds on to that ideology, I am talking of the class of academic, educated, culture Philistines. I'm talking of those people who consider themselves the heirs of Aufklärung, but who couldn't be further removed from it, who are not aufklärt, but just ausklärt, that is, not enlightened, but just entwilightened. We can observe that these people are now concerned and shocked at some of the consequences of the ideology that they spread, but without realizing that it is a consequence of this ideology. So when we now see the right on the rise, when we now see large masses of people following conspiracy theories, denying science, saying there is no climate crisis, saying there is no COVID, when we now see very successful politicians openly and brazenly lying and spreading fake news and alternative facts, then of course this academic culture Philistine elite, this ausgeklärt elite, is of course concerned. Because to be sure, they are centrists, they are good Democrats, and they are followers of whatever is currently the accepted scientific theory, to be sure. But unaufklärt as they are, they lack what is at the center of Aufklärung, that is self-criticism. They don't reflect on how these extremes that they themselves are concerned by are a natural consequence of the ideology that they spread, that these masses have now picked up and bring to its logical conclusion. Because if you start with relativism, if you start out saying there is no actual truth, well, then you shouldn't be surprised if you end up with people saying, well, in that case, I can go with my own truth. That is the result of the abandonment of actual truth, of actual reason, of actual philosophy. That is the result of abandoning the basics, the foundations on which everything else, including applied sciences, including empirical science, should be built. And that is one reason why I, as an Aufklärer, want to talk about Kant and also in the future about other philosophers, and to remind people of these basics. But with that, let's turn to the pure science in philosophy. The pure science Kant calls by its old name that existed since antiquity, he calls metaphysics. And since material philosophy is split into two parts by him, into theoretical philosophy dealing with nature and practical philosophy dealing with morality, it follows that there are two metaphysics to Kant. There is the metaphysic of nature and there is the metaphysic of morals. The question is, what exactly is metaphysics? How exactly is it distinguished from the applied science? And the usual answer that you would have gotten in the 18th century in Germany if you had asked a professor of metaphysics would probably have been that metaphysics is the science of the first principles of knowledge or the first principles of cognition. Because that was the answer that the Leibniz-Wolffian school of philosophy gave, which was the leading school in Germany. And Kant himself was under the influence of that school at first, but in his later years, in his critical period, he would criticize and reject that definition of metaphysics because he found that ultimately it was quite empty and meaningless. He would ask, well, so, first principles of knowledge. What exactly are the first principles of knowledge? Is the concept of a thing of something that exists, of an object. Is that a first principle of knowledge? Yes, would the metaphysicians say. Well then, Kant would go on asking, what about the concept of an extended thing, a thing which has extension? Is that too a first principle of knowledge? Yes. Well, what then about the concept of a body? Is that a first principle of knowledge? And if yes, then what about the concept of a fluid body? And here, if not earlier, people would say, no, a fluid body doesn't belong into metaphysics, it belongs into physics. But then where exactly is the line drawn and how? Kant says, distinguishing between the first principles of cognition and the latter principles of cognition would be a little like a historian splitting all of history into the first centuries and the latter centuries. Well, which ones are the first centuries? Is it everything up until the start of our time, until the year 1? Or does it go beyond that? Is the first century, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth century? Do these belong to the first century still? We don't know. Well, Kant here would do what is typical of him and what I have already explained earlier on in, for example, when talking about the difference between philosophy and mathematics. Kant would not go with a material distinction, so talking about the different objects the two sciences deal with and defining them by which object they are trying to find knowledge on. But rather, Kant would once again make a formal distinction. So he would separate the two sciences by their different mode of trying to find knowledge. And therefore, the definition that he gives of metaphysics is basically one that I've already given. That is, metaphysics is a science which tries to find knowledge only through pure reason. So it is a science without any empirical components. It is a science that does not deal with sensuality, but that tries to find knowledge a priori. While as soon as you have knowledge or principles a posteriori, you are no longer dealing with metaphysics, but with applied science, with applied philosophy. So that means that what you are doing in metaphysics is not that you are working with experience, but you are doing speculation. And I probably have to talk briefly about what that word means to Kant, because nowadays that word doesn't have a good reputation anymore. It is mainly used to either describe gambling at the stock market, or it is used to describe baseless assumptions. So when someone is speculating, that means they are just forming wild opinions that don't have any ground to stand on. And that probably says a lot about how our age views metaphysics. Because as exactly that, baseless assumptions that can't be proven. I find it's a shame that that word has been thrown into the dirt like that, because it comes from the Latin word for mirror. So speculation has sort of a similar meaning, if we take it literally, as reflection. So to think things through, to look at things again, to turn inwards. Well, how does Kant use the word? He actually uses it in 3 different ways. So one has to be careful when reading him, because at different places in his writings it can have slightly different meanings. The first sense in which Kant uses the word speculation actually doesn't have anything to do with metaphysics in particular. Rather, it has to do with science in general, because Kant at some times distinguishes between the common intellect and the speculative intellect. And here, speculative intellect means more or less scientific intellect. And this is a good opportunity to one more time talk about the difference between common thinking and scientific thinking from a slightly different angle than before. Because what Kant says is that the common intellect can arrive at correct judgments in concrete cases. All that is needed for that usually is what is called common sense. If you have common sense, you can probably judge an individual case correctly. However, what you can't do with just that is understanding the abstract general law behind it. So that to Kant would be the speculative intellect, the intellect who understands the law and who sees, now I'm saying it in Fichte's way, who sees the individual case come into being genetically according to this general law. I will give an example to explain what Kant means by this, and I will give an example from practical philosophy, from morality. If I were to ask random people on the street, I would probably hear correct moral judgments in individual cases. So if I ask someone, is it okay to murder? Is it okay to rape? Is it okay to rob someone? Most people would probably tell me, no, that's not okay. That's not moral. So in these individual cases, they have a correct judgment without needing to first study some moral philosophy and first having to think some moral philosophy through. However, if I were to ask them to explain their judgment, to explain why this individual behavior, this individual act is not okay, why it is a crime, they would probably not be able to give a correct answer. I would assume that the most common answer I would hear is, well, this would cause pain and suffering. If you murder someone, if you rape someone, if you rob someone, you are hurting them, and therefore you shouldn't do it. And if people answer like that, then it seems that they are subscribing to some form of utilitarianism, because that is what you call this position in moral philosophy, that you should try to cause and maximize happiness in the world, and you should try to not cause but rather to minimize pain in the world. And that does sound correct at first, to be sure, but it is quite easy to come up with other concrete individual cases where, once again, most people would say this act is immoral, this act you shouldn't do, but where this can't be explained by this act is causing suffering. So if I ask those same people on the street, is it okay to cheat on your wife, on your husband? Most of them would probably once again say no. But why not? If we assume that a cheater is good at hiding the cheating, if we assume that the person being cheated on will never find out, then it's obviously not causing any suffering. Quite the opposite, it's not causing suffering, but it's at the same time increasing happiness for me and probably for the third person with whom I'm cheating. So why shouldn't I do it then? And likewise, I mean, the internet is a disgusting place. You won't have to search for long to find, for example, guys posting about how as teenagers they would visit a friend and in a moment where no one watched them, they would go through the dirty laundry and pick out the panties of their friend's mother or sister and sniff on those panties and then masturbate with that. And once again, if I ask most normal people what they think about that, they would probably say that's not okay. But again, I ask, why shouldn't it be okay? It's not causing any suffering. Now, assuming the woman in question doesn't find out about that, in that case, she would probably be shocked and disgusted and feel used. But if she never finds out, no one suffers. And yet, we clearly see that this is not moral. And that's the point Kant is making. The common intellect may judge correctly, but he is lost or he comes up with incorrect explanations as soon as he tries to explain why he's judging that way. And by the way, I will talk about Kant's moral philosophy in later lectures. But if you are already curious, well, what is the correct moral principle if it is not to cause happiness and no suffering? Well, it is that you should have regard or reverence for every human being and for their freedom. So you should not objectify another human being and treat them merely as a means for your own goals, but rather you should always treat them as an end in itself and always have moral respect, always have regard for their own freedom. And therefore, these acts I just named are not okay, even if they don't cause any suffering, because they are still an objectification. They still mean that you abuse someone merely as a means for your own pleasure, for your own goals. But moving on. There are two other meanings of the term speculation in Kant's writing, and both are about theoretical inquiry. So speculation is thinking, using your reason to think about theoretical matters. What then is the difference? Well, Kant says we can take the word speculation in a formal sense, and then speculative would be any question that is about being. So the opposite would be practical questions, and speculative questions would basically be theoretical questions. So if it deals with being, it is speculative. The other sense would be if we take the word speculation in a material sense. And then questions would be speculative if they don't just deal with a matter of being, but if their answer, if them being answered in one way or another, has absolutely no influence on how we act whatsoever. Again, let me explain with an example, or with several examples. The question, is there a God, is, in the formal sense, a speculative question. Because I'm asking about an is. I'm asking about existence. It's a theoretical matter. It's not about what I ought to do. It's about what is or isn't. However, Kant would say that in the material sense, it is still a question that is practical, because the way the question is answered, so whether you answer yes, there is a God, or no, there is no God, probably has an influence on how you will act and behave in life. So in this case, being, or what you believe being to be like, has an influence on your acting. Likewise, the question, do we have an immortal soul, is formally speculative, because once again, I'm asking about being. But materially, it is a practical question, because once again, I will probably behave differently whether I believe that when I die, everything will be over, or whether I believe that when I die, I will live on in some way. Now, on the other hand, if you take a question like, was Jesus born by a virgin? That is a question that is not just speculative in the formal sense, Kant would say, but also in the material sense. Because, well, other questions concerning Jesus might materially be practical questions. So, for example, whether you believe that Jesus was the Son of God who died for your sins, or whether you believe he was just some random Jewish preacher who got killed and this doesn't mean anything, that will probably make you act differently in life. But whether you believe that Jesus, even if he is the Son of God, was born from a virgin or was not born from a virgin, doesn't really have any influence on anything. Likewise, while it does matter if our soul will live on after death, it doesn't matter, Kant would say, what our soul did before we were born. So I can ask, did my soul exist before birth? Is it eternal? Or did it only come into being at the moment of birth, or maybe at the moment of conception? This is a question that is speculative, not just in the formal sense, but also in the material sense, because it wouldn't change my life one bit. It wouldn't change the way I behave one bit, whether I existed before birth or not. And this kind of speculation, Kant, with his critical project, is an enemy of. He is not an enemy of speculation in the formal sense. Speculating about questions that still, while they are theoretical, still have an influence on the practical, on the way we act or ought to act. That is fine for Kant. However, these materially speculative questions, why ask them? Why waste our time with them? At most, it is empty curiosity which is driving us. But even if we could answer these questions, we don't gain anything from that answer. It adds to our knowledge, but not to our wisdom, because wisdom is, as I will address in the next lecture, wisdom is practical to Kant. And a large part of Kant's philosophy, or the foundation of Kant's philosophy, is that he gives new importance to the practical side of philosophy, that he believes the theoretical must serve the practical. Knowledge is there to be used for acting. And if it is knowledge that is not useful for anything, and then on top of that, which is the case in metaphysical matters, it is knowledge which we can't attain anyways. Like, we can't ever be sure that we have found the correct answer. Then it is a waste of time to deal with that. So this third type of speculation in the material sense, that is exactly what Kant is largely fighting against with his project of criticizing reason. But this project is something I will talk more about in further lectures. For now, let's stay with metaphysics. There are, I said, two types of metaphysics to Kant. First off, let's take a look at the metaphysics of morals, because that will be more easy and more quick. The metaphysics of morals, that is the pure practical philosophy, I will say it once again, is about the laws of freedom. So it is about what reason tells us what we should do. Well, and that which we should do is our duty. Therefore, Kant calls the metaphysics of morals sometimes also the doctrine of duties. And now he splits it into two parts, because to him there are two kinds of duties. And these two parts are the doctrine of rights or of laws, the Rechtslehre in German, and the doctrine of virtues or the ethics. Why this split? Well, the distinction Kant makes comes from whether we can be forced to do our duty or not. Because there are certain duties you can be forced to do. For example, it is your duty not to murder someone or not to steal someone's property. And this is something that even if you want to do it, you can be prevented from doing. So if you try to murder me and I am stronger than you or I have a gun, then I can force you to leave me alone and to go away. And likewise, if you try to steal from me, I can use violence, I can use my own power to force you to not steal from me, as would be your duty. And this is exactly what the state does. This is exactly what law does. It forces us through the police, through the judicial system, through threatening us with punishments. It's forcing us to do our duties. However, if we stop to think about what even can we forced to do, we find that the only thing someone can ever force us to is an action, an outward action. But what is inside of us can't be changed through force. So our will, having a good will or not having a good will, or our, what Kant in German likes to call Gesinnung, which could be translated by attitude, mindset, conviction, that can't be changed through force. So, for example, when someone wants to murder you because maybe he hates you for some reason, maybe if you have the power, if you have a gun, for example, you can force him to abstain from that action. You can force him to step away and not murder you, but you cannot force him to want to abstain from that action. You cannot, by pointing a gun at him, change his will to murder you. Therefore, the doctrine of rights would deal with those duties that are duties to act in a certain way, which we could be forced to, while the doctrine of virtues deals with duties that we can only force ourselves to do. And forcing yourself in this way is what Kant calls virtue. And therefore the doctrine of virtues deals with the inner side, deals with your actual will, not just your outer actions. That's why it is the ethics. And in regular law, in the state, we find that it is our actions that matter. So if I don't murder anyone, I will not be convicted and I will not end up in prison. No judge will ask if I secretly want to murder people, maybe, and just abstain from it because I'm afraid of the police and because I'm afraid of prisons. It is enough for the judicial system that I don't murder. But if there was a higher judge who could look into our heart, that is God, then he surely would judge us according not to our actions, but according to our actual will. So he would be concerned with whether we did our duties of virtue and not just our duties of right. But that's all for now, which I want to say about the metaphysics of morals. Kant often calls it simply morals, and he often uses the word metaphysics only to refer to the metaphysics of nature, which in those cases he simply calls metaphysics, period. And that, to be sure, is how the word metaphysics has mostly been used in the history of philosophy. It has mostly referred only to pure theoretical philosophy, not so much the practical one. So I want to do the same from now on. So unless stated otherwise, when I say metaphysics now in this lecture or in all the upcoming ones, it will only refer to the theoretical metaphysics, to the metaphysics of nature. Well, how are they structured according to Kant? First off, he splits them into two parts. That is what he calls general metaphysics and special metaphysics. The difference here is this: both, being metaphysics, seek knowledge through pure reason and not through empirical means. But special metaphysics seek knowledge of certain objects, be it God, be it the world, be it the soul, while general metaphysics seeks knowledge through reason, but not about a specific object outside of reason that we try to examine and understand through our reason, but rather general metaphysics seeks knowledge about reason itself. And this general metaphysics, Kant says, is ontology. Ontology being a name or being a philosophical subject which exists since antiquity. And to in Greek means being, the being. So ontology is the part of philosophy that deals with being, with existence. Kant in German translates it with Wesenslehre and not with Seinslehre. And Seinslehre would be the doctrine of being, while Wesenlehre would be more like the doctrine of essence. And in that, we can already get a small sense of the shift that Kant's critique brings about in philosophy. That shift being that ontology is no longer about the existence of things, but rather about the essence of things. What ontology is to Kant is a sort of metaphysics. He says that this general metaphysics is to special metaphysics what metaphysics as a whole is to natural science. He also calls ontology a grammar of sorts, a grammar of reason. So that is because ontology is about the basic concepts of our reason. Concepts like being and non-being, existence and non-existence, possibility and impossibility, necessity and contingency. So just like grammar itself is nothing, like grammar itself doesn't contain any statements about objects. What grammar contains is the basic elements of a language. It contains the rules which every sentence in that language has to follow. But then all the sentences, they are not just language. They are not just mere form, but they have a content. They are statements about the world, about things that are or that aren't. They are more than just grammar, but as parts of language, as statements made in language, they have to follow the rules of grammar, and they have to be composed of the basic elements of that language. And the same is true when we look at ontology. In itself, it teaches nothing about things. It doesn't say whether a thing exists or doesn't exist. It just says what a thing even is, what existence or non-existence even is. And then all the statements you make about objects in special metaphysics or in natural science, all those statements have to be made out of the basic elements of our thinking, which ontology deals with. So, for example, every specific thing that you think, whether it's God or the soul, or whether it's a raindrop or an animal, you have to think all of them as either existing or not existing, as either being possible or either being impossible. So, for example, when you think of a unicorn, you think of it as being possible but not existing. When you think of a four-angled triangle, you think of it as not just not existing, but also as being impossible. These basic elements of our thinking are the topic of ontology. But then let's turn to special metaphysics. Once again, it has two parts. Remember, I covered this in an earlier lecture. It's always two parts with Kant, because all of these distinctions are logical distinctions, and therefore they are by necessity dichotomies. Well, special metaphysics, Kant splits in the same way as he splits every science. Remember, Kant says every science has a pure science and an applied science. So the same is true for special metaphysics. There is pure metaphysics and then there's applied metaphysics. But in this case, this distinction might be kind of surprising and kind of confusing. Because if you have kept track of what I said in this lecture and in previous lectures, then you will know that applied science to Kant means a science with empirical elements, a science where reason is applied to experience. But then on the other hand, metaphysics by Kant is defined as a non-empirical science, a science which only uses pure reason. How then can there be such a thing as an applied metaphysics? Isn't that a self-contradiction? Well, the applied metaphysics to Kant is one of and the same as the pure natural science. I already said that natural science is split by Kant into psychology and physics. That is the natural science of the inner nature and of the outer nature. And therefore, applied metaphysics is also split into these two parts. But this time we are not talking about empirical psychology and empirical physics, but rather we are talking about rational psychology and rational physics. And I want to stress, especially in the case of rational psychology, that you must not think of what we nowadays would call psychology. You must not associate it with that. Rational psychology, to Kant, is the science of the soul and of the nature of the soul through pure reason. Rational psychology would deal with such questions as, is our soul immortal? And if so, what might happen to it after death? Does it go to heaven or hell? Does it become one with God? Is it reborn? Or rational psychology would deal with the question, how is the soul connected to the body when they are so different in essence? Or it would ask, what was the soul's condition before we started this life in our body? Did it exist elsewhere outside of the body and then come into the body when we were born or conceived? Or did it only form together with the body? And how did it get into the body? Was it put there by God, or is the soul in a sort of sleeping state carried around inside the mother or the father and then passed on to the child? Those would be questions for rational psychology. And obviously, no modern day psychologist would deal with such questions. Because what we call psychology now would be what Kant would call empirical psychology. So, trying to make empirical observations about how the soul of humans, that is, how the emotions and the thinking of humans, how they function, how they work. But this is rational psychology, which is only trying to understand the basic nature of the soul through reason. But still, we are left with the open question, how can there be an applied metaphysics? Well, Kant says the objects that this applied metaphysics deals with, that is, the soul in the case of rational psychology, and matter in the case of rational physics, these objects are objects that we only know of because of experience. Just through rational thinking alone, you could never form a concept of a thinking being or an extended being. Just through rational thinking alone, you could never come to know that such a thing as a soul, as a thinking being, or such a thing as a body, a material being that is extended in space, that such things exist. So that means that applied metaphysics takes its object from experience. But that is only the very first step. And all the other steps that are made in this science are made without empirical help, are made only through speculation. Because rational psychology and rational physics are basically saying, well, from experience, we now know that such a thing as the soul or as extended matter does exist. And now we want to try and think about what we can know simply from reason, without using experience, about these two things. While, on the other hand, in pure metaphysics, the very object itself, so for example, the object here might be God. God is obviously not an object that we got from our experience, but here rather the very object itself we only found through thinking. When we think, when we use our reason, we can come up with the idea of God. And now, once again, we try and determine what can we know about this object, what can we know about, for example, God, through pure reason. So without needing some sort of divine revelation, but only by thinking about this idea of God for ourselves. So then if we compare applied and pure metaphysics, we see that they are both metaphysics insofar as they only use reason and not experience to find knowledge. And in that sense, they both are free from any empirical elements. But the objects that they are thinking about, the objects they want to have knowledge of, the objects they are sort of examining through reason, these objects are empirical in the case of applied metaphysics, and they are not empirical in the case of pure metaphysics. I think what is helpful here is two terms that Kant uses and that we will hear about again in later lectures because they are quite important to his critical project. And those are the terms immanent and transcendent. Both immanent and transcendent are here referring to our experience. What Kant says is that metaphysics as a whole is trying to find truth only through rational thought, not through experience. But in applied metaphysics, our reason is immanent. The translation that Kant gives for immanent in German is einheimisch, which means something like domestic. So in applied metaphysics, reason is immanent or domestic in relation to experience, because applied metaphysics applies reason to objects which we know from experience, that is the soul and extended matter. On the other hand, the word transcendent, Kant in German translates with überschwänglich, which if I tried to retranslate it into English, I would probably translate with overswinging. So what he's saying there is that in pure metaphysics, our reason transcends or swings over from experience into a realm completely beyond experience, because the very objects it deals with and tries to get knowledge about, the very objects are objects that we don't know from experience. And that is exactly the problem. Applied metaphysics is not such a big problem to Kant, but his critical project will show that pure metaphysics is a problem, because we don't even know if the objects, like for example God, that we try to find knowledge about, if the very objects even exist. And therefore we have no basis for all our speculation in pure metaphysics. But that I will explain further in future lectures when I actually talk about Kant's critical philosophy. For now, I am just talking about the distinctions he makes. So now let's look at this pure metaphysics, because here too Kant once again makes a distinction into two different fields, two different sciences, but this, I promise, is going to be the last of all of these distinctions he makes. Pure metaphysics, Kant says, is either dealing with the world, and that would be cosmology, or it is dealing with God, and that would be theology. So I want to stress that this is rational theology. Usually what people mean when they say theology, like when you study theology nowadays, but also in Kant's day, the theological faculty, which I mentioned before, usually that is referring to revelatory theology. Because here you start with some sort of revelation, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or whatever, but you assume that God has revealed himself, and now you are using reason, you are applying reason to that revelation and trying to better understand that revelation. And that, to Kant, is not part of metaphysics or of philosophy at all. That is its own faculty. And to Kant, it was very important to mind the borders between different sciences and between different faculties. The theology that is a part of philosophy, or more specifically, that is part of metaphysics, that is part of pure metaphysics, that is rational theology. And this theology is trying to find truths about God simply through reason. So there are some things that you can't arrive at through reason alone. Even someone who believes in these statements will have to agree that simple reason, simple rational thought, could never come up with the statement that Jesus is the Son of God who died for our sins, or Muhammad is the prophet of God, or the Jews are God's chosen people. That is simply not something that mere reason can tell us. There is only something that God himself maybe can tell us through a revelation, and that we then can either believe or not believe in. But maybe there are certain general questions about God that reason can solve. For one, is there a God or not? And this is what rational theology is dealing with. But what about cosmology, on the other hand? That too might confuse you a little, because you might think, how is the world? How is that something that belongs into pure metaphysics? Isn't the world something we have experience of? Kant says no. We have experience of things that are in the world. But the world as a whole, as something complete, the world is an idea, a supersensual idea, and we can never experience the world as a whole. Because in order for that to be possible, we would have to be outside the world somehow and to observe it from outside. And this metaphysical, this rational cosmology is dealing with general questions about the world, such as, is the world eternal and never ending? Or does the world have a beginning in time and a limit in space? Or also the question, is the world composed of simple parts which can't further be divided? Or can the world be divided into infinitely smaller and smaller parts? These are obviously metaphysical questions that experience can never solve. Like, from experience, I could never know, for example, that the world doesn't have an end. Even if I were to take a spaceship and fly out there, I could fly on and on and on, and all I could say is that so far I haven't reached the end, but I could never be sure if the world is endless or if when I fly on I will somehow finally reach the end at some point. Only through rational thinking can I try and answer this question. I would add here, by the way, if we once again compare applied metaphysics and pure metaphysics, then I would think, and it seems to me that Kant thinks the same, I would think that applied metaphysics is mostly applied cosmology. Because after all, the souls, so thinking beings, and material bodies, extended beings, that is exactly what the cosmos, what the world is made of. One could ask then if there is also such a thing as applied theology. And I think there is an answer which is implied by Kant's system, even though Kant never states this answer. Maybe he doesn't state it because in his time that still was something you had to be careful with the censorship at the time. But I would say that the revelatory theology could be considered applied theology, because rational theology in metaphysics is simply thinking about God rationally and asking what can we know about God through reason. For example, can we know if there is a God? And then revelatory theology is based on a revelation which in a way could be considered empirical. I mean, when you yourself receive a vision, or when you witness a miracle, or when someone is telling you that someone else did miracles or received visions, then that is something happening in the empirical plane. Then that is something that, hypothetically at least, you could have experience of. So that would mean that this theology applies the rational theology, the metaphysical theology, to a specific experience that we may believe that we have of God, to a specific revelation of God. But you might ask, why is that even the split that Kant does in pure metaphysics? Why split it into cosmology and theology? And to Kant, it's always very important to be systematic and architectonic. It's always very important to not just randomly come up with these different fields, because that would always leave the possibility that there are more that you probably just didn't think of, but that would also be possible. No, for him it's very important that these distinctions are made by reason itself and are therefore exhaustive. Well, why would reason make this particular distinction? Because if we put applied metaphysics aside, then metaphysics deals with objects which we don't know from experience, but only through thinking. And then Kant says there are only three ways to think of such objects. The first is distributively. That means thinking about a single object. Just an object in itself, not in any particular relation to other objects. And that is exactly what ontology is doing. And then the other two ways are ways of thinking about the composition of various objects, how objects are connected. And here you might remember what I already said in a previous lecture. To Kant, this can only mean either coordination, and the coordination of all objects all together is the world, or this can mean subordination. And if I think about how all objects in existence are subordinated to one another, then I will arrive at the idea of a highest object, which is above all else and from which all else is coming. this can better be understood through Kant's table of categories. I will only talk about this table of categories in a later lecture and explain what it is, what it means, how Kant found it. But even so, I still want to mention this. In the table of categories, Kant says there are only 3 types of relations. I mentioned this before. These 3 types are either the relation of a thing with itself or with its own attributes. That is the category of substance and accident. And from this category, you could arrive at the science of ontology. Then secondly, you have the relation between a cause and its effect. That is the category of causality. And that would lead you to rational theology as a science. The science of the highest cause, so to say. And then thirdly, you have the category of community. That is, you have relations between things that influence one another and that form a whole together. And that, if we think of that as a metaphysical science, would lead us to the science of cosmology. However, I also want to digress for a moment and go from Kant to his most important disciple, to Fichte. Because Fichte found that our thinking is always fivefold in structure. Now, I can't go more deeply into what that means or how Fichte arrived at that, because then I would have to hold a Fichte lecture, which I want to do in some future time, but not now. But for now, it's enough to say that all our thinking that is simply in the nature of reason must be fivefold in structure, Fichte says. And when he says fivefold, that doesn't mean that these 5 parts are all equal, are all the same. But rather, Fichte says there's always one middle part connecting the others, and then there are 2 couples. And here, one couple always represents more of the outside, and one couple represents a more inner quality. And then again, in each couple, we have the same distinction one more time. So in each couple, we have one part which is more of an outer quality and one part which is more of an inner quality. So why am I mentioning this? Because to me, as someone who knows Fichte very well and who has read a lot of Fichte, it was quite remarkable how well this fits with Kant. Because we could say, it was quite remarkable how well this fits with Kant. Because we could say that each of the 2 types of philosophy is composed according to this fivefoldness. So in practical philosophy, we would have the doctrine of happiness, which is the more outward side, and we would have the doctrine of duties, which is representing the more inward side of the practical. And then once again, the doctrine of happiness would be split into the economy dealing with individual happiness and the politics dealing with the happiness of the nation. And the doctrine of duties, the metaphysics of morals, would be split into the doctrine of rights, which would again be the outside part, because, as I said earlier, it is about actions, about what we do outwardly, about something we can be forced to do, while the doctrine of virtues would represent the inner side, because it is about our goodwill or lack of goodwill. It is about our inner virtue, about us forcing ourselves. And then the fifth, which holds it all together, would be practical philosophy itself. And likewise in theoretical philosophy, or in theoretical metaphysics, we could say the same. We could say that we have the applied metaphysics, or pure rational science, which is the outer part of that whole science, because it deals with objects that we can experience. And we have as the inner side the pure metaphysics, dealing with objects we can only think but not experience. And then once again, both are split into two. Applied metaphysics as an outer side would be rational physics, and the inner side of it would be the rational psychology, dealing with the soul, dealing with the inner nature. And in pure metaphysics, you would have cosmology as the outer part and rational theology as the inner part. And the fifth, holding all of it together, would once again be the concept of metaphysics in general, or rather, it would be the general metaphysics, that is, it would be ontology. Because all things, no matter into which of these four other sciences they fall, no matter if it's soul or body or world or God, all things have to be thought of through the basic elements of our thinking, like the concept of being or of necessity or of possibility. And then you could also say that philosophy altogether is also structured according to this fivefoldness. Here the outer couple would be the theoretical philosophy, because that deals with being, and the inner couple would be practical philosophy, dealing with freedom, dealing with what should be. And in both, you would have once again two sides, the outer being the applied, the empirical part, and the inner one being the pure, the rational part. And holding everything together in this case would, of course, be philosophy as a general concept. And maybe most of you, or maybe all of you, won't be able to make much of this or to understand it very well, because you don't know about Fichte and his idea of this fivefoldness. And as I said, I can't possibly go further into this without digressing completely and starting Fichte lectures. But since Fichte is very important to me, and since this stood out to me, I did want to mention it. And to those who do know about Fichte and his fivefoldness, this might be remarkable, and this might maybe be indicating that Fichte really was onto something. Because Kant came before Fichte, he didn't read Fichte, he didn't know about this idea of fivefoldness, so it's not like he tried to meet the structure that Fichte had given him. It seems that just naturally, just by accident, he ended up creating a system in just that structure. And that to Fichte wouldn't be a surprise, because Fichte is saying that this is how we think. So Fichte would say every complete rational structure would somehow end up showing this fivefoldness. But with that, let me go back to Kant. All of these various fields of metaphysics, like rational psychology, rational theology, cosmology, ontology, all of these aren't things that Kant himself came up with. In fact, if you know a little about German philosophy in the 18th century, if you know a little about Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy, if you read Christian Wolff, or if you read other important philosophers that were part of his school later, like Baumgarten, you will find that they already talked about the same sciences, using the same terminology. So, for example, talking about general metaphysics being ontology and special metaphysics. So here you can find that Kant, even in his critical period, was still very much influenced by the structure, by the system, by the terminology of the philosophy he had grown up with, even when he ended up criticizing it and largely rejecting its statements and claims. And even if you just look one generation further, if you look at Fichte, for example, and then also at the others that come later, like Hegel, you will find much more independence from the old Leibniz-Wolffian terminologies and systems. What is, however, original about everything I said here in this lecture, so what does come from Kant, is not so much the content of what is metaphysics and which parts is metaphysics composed of, but it is the systematic structure of it all. That which Kant would call the architectonics of it, and which to him was very important. Because, for example, to Wolff, Wolff also said that in metaphysics you have rational psychology, you have cosmology, you have rational theology. But to him, these three would sort of be on one level. While Kant clearly says, no, cosmology and theology are part of pure metaphysics because they deal with objects that we have no experience of at all, while rational psychology, together with rational physics, belongs to applied metaphysics, because they deal with objects that they didn't come up with simply by thinking, but objects that they have taken from experience. So it's not these various fields that Kant came up with, but the specific order in which he places them, which is specific to him and which is original. And that is something that was very, very important to Kant. You might think that this is not very important, or even that this is quite tedious. And Kant would say only through these architectonics can we be assured that our system is complete. Otherwise, there would always remain the possibility that there are more possible parts of metaphysics, more possible sciences one could come up with. What Kant tried is letting reason structure the whole system, letting reason find which places, which hypothetical sciences, because it always remains possible that a science like, for example, rational theology is just an idea, but must remain an empty science because we can't know anything about God through simply thinking rationally. But at least as hypothetical sciences, at least as, so to say, empty spaces in the system that beg to be filled, reason can come up with them, and with just them. And that is important to Kant in order to form a complete system. And he would say that completion is possible in metaphysics. Because let's turn back for a moment to the difference between natural science and metaphysics. An important difference, Kant would say, is that natural science first starts with an object and has no concept of the object. So, for example, I discover a new physical phenomenon. I discover a new element. I discover a new species of animals. I discover a new planet. The object is there first, and now I try to form a concept of that object. Now I try to learn things about that object. While in metaphysics, Kant says, it is the opposite. I first have a concept of God, for example, or of freedom, and now I try to learn more about that concept, and one central question here is there even an object that this concept is referring to, or is it an empty concept? And Kant says metaphysics is a science that can be completed. Empirical science can never be complete. We can always make new experiences, and we can always learn new things about the world which we experience. There's always more to find, more knowledge to gain. But in metaphysics, we are ultimately not dealing with objects that are outside of us and that we observe and try to find out more about, but ultimately we are dealing with ourselves, with our own reason, with the questions our own reason is posing to us. And therefore, metaphysics must be finite, Kant says. And therefore, it must be possible to answer all questions in metaphysics. However, when I say answer, I don't mean, or Kant doesn't mean, that it must be possible to solve all the questions. So, for example, when I say the question for God's existence must be answerable, that doesn't mean it must be possible to decide finally and forever whether God exists or doesn't exist. It is also a possibility, Kant says, that we come to the conclusion that the question is not solvable. But that too would be an answer. That would at least tell us here we don't have to look further. It's not just the case that so far we haven't found the right answer and now we need to think more or do more research, inquire more to one day find the answer. But no, rather reason can tell us, stop thinking in this direction. It's pointless. You will never find an answer. And at least that must be possible for every metaphysical question, Kant says. Either we must be able to solve it, or we must be able to see and to prove that it can't be solved at all. This difference between natural science and metaphysics also means that only natural science can truly bring us new knowledge. I think this is a quite important point Kant makes, quite an important observation. In philosophy, that is, in metaphysics, you must not expect to find out any new truth that has so far been hidden. And if someone comes along and tells you that he, through mere thinking, without any observation, without any experience, found a new truth that no one before in the history of humanity and thousands of years had found, he is full of himself and he is trying probably to deceive you, and you shouldn't even listen to such a person, whatever he has to say. Philosophy, that is one important conclusion of Kant's whole project. Philosophy is not really about objects. It's not about the world outside of us. Leave that to natural science. Philosophy is about the subject, about ourselves. Ultimately, it is only reason reflecting on itself. How could it ever find anything new that is not already inside of it? It only deals with itself and with what is already there. So all that philosophy or all that metaphysics can ever do is lift things, lift our concepts, lift our ideas to more clarity. So someone can possibly say, I managed to delve deeper into a certain thought, to understand it better and more clearly than anyone has before. That is possible. And thereby I can maybe bring something that so far people knew only unconsciously, only vaguely. I can maybe bring it to more clarity. I gave an example for that earlier when I talked about morality. Remember, we do have a vague idea of what is moral and what is not moral. No one can or should tell us a completely new moral law that is not already inside us, but the philosopher can bring more clarity into it. But don't let anyone ever tell you that through mere reason, through mere metaphysics, they arrived at a completely new truth that hasn't been known before, not even vaguely. But now the question remains, why deal with metaphysics at all? Kant says that the two metaphysics, the metaphysics of nature and the metaphysics of morals, are the two hinges on which philosophy hinges. But why? Why are they important? Many people nowadays would say they aren't. Metaphysics is just empty speculation. It's just a waste of time. I won't deal with that. And that's an opinion, that's an attitude that started even in Kant's day. In Germany, it wasn't yet as prominent back then. In other countries, namely in France and in England, it had already become more popular. People had already started disregarding metaphysics. But to this, Kant says, everyone has his metaphysics. Even the materialist does. Even if you say there is no God and there is no immortal soul, that is still a metaphysical statement. So whether you like it or not, you do hold a metaphysical opinion. And that you shouldn't do. You shouldn't hold opinions in metaphysics. You should try to find truth. It is therefore not reasonable, Kant would say, to just completely discard metaphysics. But of course, it's also not reasonable to just simply do metaphysics and arrive at whatever conclusions and whatever opinions you like best. So simply because you want to keep existing, you end up telling yourself and seemingly proving that the soul is immortal. No, rather, and this is Kant's big philosophical project, rather, he says, we first need to criticize metaphysics, or rather, we need to criticize reason, because reason is that which we alone use to arrive at truth in metaphysics. We speculate through reason. So we must first criticize reason and understand how reason works and what reason can accomplish and what it can't accomplish, which truth it can possibly find and which it can't find. What is curious, Kant says, and this is what I will end on, what is curious is that metaphysics seem to be a basic need of humanity or of human reason, because he points out that it is older than natural science. One would assume that since the first thing we observe in the world, the first thing we perceive is the material world, is that which we can experience, and not God, for example, one would assume that science would have started with that. But even before trying to do natural science and trying to better understand the nature directly around them, people were already thinking about and forming beliefs about God or about the soul and the afterlife. And this points, Kant says, at metaphysics being a basic human need of sorts. But why is that? Or in what way is it a basic human need? Because Kant wouldn't say that this is true for all of metaphysics. It is not true for applied metaphysics. Applied metaphysics, while it was important for him, is not strictly necessary, Kant would say. Because he would say, if it wasn't proven before, then Newton had proven that you could get quite far in natural science without any metaphysics. You could get quite far in physics by simply using empirical observation and mathematics. So you don't necessarily need metaphysics for natural science. And I would assume that this is precisely a reason why metaphysics is not taken seriously anymore nowadays, and why metaphysics has been discarded. Because nowadays we do almost exclusively care about natural science. And then we are somewhat right to not pay much mind to metaphysics. What also doesn't seem to be a basic human need is ontology. As I said before, Kant compares it to grammar. And humans used language. They even used language for art. They composed poems and songs and stories long before they started studying grammar in a more or less scientific way. Because ultimately, grammar is just a tool to speak correctly, but it doesn't interest us in itself. And the same, Kant says, is true about ontology. All ontology does is bring more clarity into the basic concepts we use, into the basic elements of our thinking, but we only need that not for its own sake, but to better and more clearly think other things. What are these other things then? What is it we want to think? Well, Kant says there are three ideas that we really care about. And that is God, that is the immortality of the soul, and that is freedom. These three ideas, as well as the interest we take in them, are rooted in human reason. They are necessary ideas. Which is not to say that their objects are necessary. So this is not supposed to be an argument, for example, for the existence of God. The idea could be empty. But at least as an idea, it is necessary. Meaning, if we use our reason in a certain way, if we think about the world, we will end up coming up with this idea. And then we will end up caring about this idea. Caring about knowing whether that idea is empty or not. Whether there is a God, whether the soul is immortal, whether we are free or not. These, Kant says, are three ideas of supersensual objects. The soul is the supersensual in the world. God is the supersensual beyond the world. And freedom is the supersensual which connects both of them. Because I can assume that if there is a God, and if I am free to be good or evil, then if I use my freedom according to God's will, if I do what God wants, I have grounds to hope that I will live on after my death and that I will be rewarded by God. But only then. And these three supersensual ideas Kant connects with three metaphysical sciences, that is, with rational psychology, rational cosmology, and rational theology. I think it is quite obvious that the question whether we have an immortal soul or not belongs to rational psychology, and the question whether God exists or not belongs to rational theology. The idea of freedom belonging to cosmology might be confusing to you at first, but the point here is that cosmology asks, well, is the cosmos, is the world ruled by one law of nature determining everything that happens in the world? And that would mean that we, as parts of the world, are also ruled by that law and are therefore not free. Or is, even despite the law of causality ruling the world, is there a place for starting a new chain of causality without being caused yourself? And therefore, the idea of freedom belongs to cosmology. Of course, these three sciences also pose other questions, and I talked about some of those questions in this lecture. For example, cosmology also asks, does the world have an end, or does it go on forever? Or is the world composed of simple parts, or can it be divided forever and forever? Or psychology also poses the question, where was the soul, or what was the soul, or was there even a soul before I lived? But these questions, Kant says, are more speculative in the material sense. And they are more side questions that we ask out of curiosity, or that we ask because we hope that their answer will help us somehow in answering the main questions. But what we really care about is there a God? Are we free? Will our soul live on after death? And this we care about so much, Kant says, that we would throw all other science. The mathematician, the natural scientist would throw all of their knowledge away if we could have an answer and be sure that the answer is right on these three ideas. And that concludes my lectures on the school concept of philosophy, because that ultimately is what philosophy is to Kant as a science. It is the science that mainly deals with these three ideas. And since it deals with the three most important ideas to us, since it deals with the questions that are most dear to us, it has, at least in theory, the highest dignity of all the sciences and is the queen of all the sciences, Kant says. But I say in theory because the question is still open whether philosophy or whether metaphysics can deliver, whether it actually can tell us anything about these three ideas. But this is what, to Kant, makes up the core of philosophy. Philosophy in the more narrow sense, so if we exclude natural science, is metaphysics. And metaphysics in the narrow sense, or at least if we look at what truly matters to us in metaphysics and what probably prompted us to once millennia or centuries ago start with metaphysics at all, that is these three ideas of God, freedom, and immortality of the soul. And what Kant has to say about these three ideas, and before that, what he has to say about how we can do metaphysics and whether it is even possible to answer them or not, that I will talk about in future lectures, but not without first, and that I will come to in the next lecture, without first also having talked about the world concept of philosophy. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Kubilai Celik, Thomas Deuringer, Garnau Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Samit Özkilic, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklärung course.